Science fiction is a subgenre of speculative fiction that focuses on the impact of actual or imagined science upon worlds, societies, or individuals. It features technologies and other elements that do not exist in real life but may be supposed to be created or discovered in the future through scientific advancement, such as advanced robots, interstellar travel, aliens, time travel, mutants, and cyborgs. Many science fiction stories are set in the future. The appeal is an escape from the limits of everyday thinking to see what is possible. It can be a very good intellectual challenge to dive into a good science fiction novel. It's a literary response to the technological explosion that we're living in our world today. There's a lot of excitement. There's the thrill of a good adventure. It allows anyone to read an imaginative story without feeling like it's a book for little kids. It also presents real world heroes doing noble things in worlds without anyone worth admiring, like situations that teens may be facing as they look around them. Science fiction has a shorter history than fantasy. It basically kicked off in 1818 with Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. That is science fiction and not fantasy because the scientist created the creature through his knowledge of biology, not magic. YA science fiction has developed much slower than adult sci-fi. In most of the history of science fiction, teens who liked to read it had to read science fiction that was written for adults because it wasn't written for them for a long time. In 1869, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea by Jules Verne was published. That was for an adult audience. So was War of the Worlds and The Lost World. Although the first pulp fiction magazines were published around the 1870s, the ones that targeted teens weren't really around until the 30s. And at that time, pulp fiction magazines and radio shows targeting teen readers included stories about a boy genius inventor who created helicopter airships and robots. Buck Rogers in the 25th Century was another popular radio show. And in the 30s, comic strips in the newspaper included Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon. So that's when the teen audience started to grow more. And then in the 50s to the present, it has continued to grow in popularity as a genre as society becomes more technologically based. In fact, fantasy and science fiction are two of the fastest growing genres in YA Lit. Here are some common science fiction subgenres just to help you sort of place them in your brain where they fit. Some tropes that you will see in science fiction include beings and entities. So, this focus on otherness and sameness. What's the difference between a human, an alien, and a machine? Origin stories, where characters might not know if they're human or machine or alien. That kind of thing would be in the beings and entities trope. Body and mind alterations is another trope. This has to do with consciousness and self awareness, intelligence and artificial intelligence, human fears extrapolated. Sometimes you have characters who are telepathic and surprise each other with that ability because they didn't know that they could connect to someone. Habitats have to do with parallel worlds, other worlds, environmental disasters, the need to travel from one world to another because of an environmental disaster, that sort of thing. Political conflicts are about societies in conflict or war zones and how that impacts the world. Technology could be implications for humankind, cloning and DNA, moral responsibility of scientists. If we create this, what is our obligation to the world? And then the future is sort of wide open. It can include anything that's possible in the future. It can include time travel. That is a trope that has been a part of science fiction as long as the genre has existed. Common writing styles, they're also plot driven. They're based on the thought or the premise of the story, and it has to follow very close reasoning. They blend genre a lot. You will see more humor in science fiction than in most fantasy novels. That's kind of growing in popularity right now. They may be optimistic about the future and reflect the reality that teens may be able to avoid mistakes their elders made and may be able to create better new realities on their own. Arthur C. Clarke, a popular science fiction writer from several generations ago, wrote, "A critical reading of science fiction is essential training for anyone wishing to look more than 10 years ahead." And one of the things that is unique to science fiction is that many things that are written about in science fiction eventually come to be fact in the future because science fiction writers are not making things up out of their own minds. They are paying attention to what's happening in science and in society, and they're speculating about what would be possible down the road with a little more technology and time. And so things like self driving cars were a thing in science fiction in the 50s and 60s, and now you can get a Tesla that will park itself. So a lot of things like that start in science fiction and then become reality in our world as technology develops. How do you measure the quality of science fiction? The technology needs to be believable. It doesn't have to be believable at the time. You just have to believe that it's within the realm of possibility for this technology to exist. Needs to be well-reasoned speculation about the future. You need to be able to follow along with the thought of, "Oh, yeah, that could happen." Plot and society must have internal consistency and plausibility. So if you have rules within a society, then that society needs to follow them. If you have rules within the plot or within that universe, then everything that happens need to follow along with those uh, consistent plot points and be believable within that society and that plot. And they also provide real insight into real world issues. So, real world issues like the role of technology in society, what technology is doing to us as people, what's on the horizon for what might be possible for us as human beings, what are the dangers of things that we're doing to the environment, things that we know and we can see actual science based results, data. This is a problem in our environment. What's that going to be like in the future? So they give you insight. These stories that are really well crafted give you insight into real world issues like that. Criticisms. They can be too focused on technical details or science, or there can be insufficient explanations for what happens. So you have to hit the sweet spot. You have to explain the technology or the science enough without boring people. And you have to put in enough detail so that the plot makes sense to people. There can be a lack of representation or diversity. Plot flaws or contradictions are fatal in science fiction. That's like the worst thing that you can do as a bad science fiction writer because it wrecks your whole argument, your whole premise that you're building is wrecked if you have a plot flaw or a contradiction. They may lack character development. Sometimes they're so focused on the plot and on making the science work or the story work that they don't fully flesh out their characters. And when examined closely, many sci fi novels rely more on fantasy elements than scientific speculation. So they may call themselves sci fi, but they may really be fantasy. Trends in science fiction. There is a wider array of visions about possible future realities, some of which can be hopeful. There's a surprise. The lines are blurring between young adult and adult science fiction. Sometimes the only difference is the age of the characters and the amount of scientific detail. Multimedia development, movies, graphic novels, video and role playing games, toys, cartoons allow readers to live the adventure. This is sort of the whole premise behind Universal Studios in Florida. Writers are increasingly using science fiction as a way to urge people to examine the impact of government policies, cultural habits of consumption, and attitudes about others. So you get a lot of warning type novels in science fiction of if this keeps happening, then this will be the result. Change now while you're still ahead. Here are the sources for this lecture. I hope you enjoy speculative fiction as much as I do.